The valleys of South Wales have a long association with the steam locomotive. 20 years before the opening of the Stockton and Darlington Railway, Richard Trevithick's steam locomotive ran on the Penydarren tram road between Merthyr Tydfil and Abercynon. A century later, it was the heavy freight locomotives of the Great Western 28XX class which hauled the coal away from the mines. The Pontypool and Blaenavon Railway, the only preserved railway in the county of Gwent, actually runs on former London North Western Railway track, which reached into the valley from the north. It was not an easy route from Bryn Mawr, and the midpoint station of Blaenavon was at 1,400 feet, the highest in England and Wales. This unusual outside-cylindered pannier tank was built by Bagnall in 1940 as one of 4 destined for a meter gauge system in Turkey. The war prevented their shipment, and they were bought and re-gauged by the Brookfield Foundry in Stoke-on-Trent. They were retired in the mid-60s, and this machine was restored in Enfield. She eventually moved here in 1986. The Pontypool and Blaenavon Railway was formed in 1983 as one of a number of industrial heritage projects in this area. Close cooperation with the nearby Big Pit Museum has always been a feature of its existence, and most of the people who come here visit the 2 attractions. An objective is to extend the line in both directions. Perhaps in future, it will not be just a half-mile stretch of 1 in 40 gradient taxing locomotives to the limit, but a continuing climb over the dizzy heights of Blaenavon to Bryn Mawr. Not far to the west of the Pontypool and Blaenavon Railway is a very different kind of line, the Brecon Mountain Railway. The terminal station of Pant, just north of Merthyr Tydfil, was completed in 1984. It stands directly above the disused Morlaix Tunnel of the old Brecon and Merthyr Railway. Its distinctive ventilation shafts have become a design feature of the new station. Pant is the line's headquarters, and there are extensive workshop facilities on the site. The railway is in the same ownership as the Vale of Rheidol Railway, and that line's locomotive, Prince of Wales, is currently being rebuilt here. The steam locomotive on duty today was built by Arne Jung in what is now East Germany in 1908. This is the only locomotive from the German Democratic Republic regularly at work in the British Isles today. This wonderful little 062 tank engine spent all its early life on the Mecklenburg-Pommersche Schmalspur-Bahn, where she bore the number 5. She was renumbered by the state railway system as 993353, which it carried right up to the early 1970s. She was acquired through a West German agent in 1973, and she was stored in Llanberis for 6 months before rebuilding started. Today, she bears the name Graf Schwerin-Löwitz, and her polished brass complements her Crimson Lake livery, making her one of the most beautiful narrow-gauge engines in operation anywhere. Unlike standard gauge railways, there's not a ready supply of redundant passenger rolling stock, and the railway has built some distinctive carriages with end balconies. These have light and airy interiors, although many passengers seem to prefer standing at the ends when the weather is fine. The latest construction is this caboose, which faithfully follows plans acquired from America. Its side doors allow wheelchairs to come aboard, and its raised lookout clerestory gives a view along the train only previously known to brakemen and conductors in the United States. Construction of the first 2 miles over the trackbed of a line closed by British Railways in 1964 began in 1978. Plans are in hand to extend the line to a total length of 5.5 miles, all but a mile of which is in the Brecon Beacons National Park. The line begins in the county of Mid Glamorgan and will end in the county of Powys. This means that there are a number of authorities involved in negotiations and severe building restrictions apply in the park area, but difficulties are gradually being overcome. In the meantime, the railway runs through some simply stunning scenery, and the line has its temporary terminus at Pontisciel, which means the Bridge of the Stile, overlooking the delightful Taff Fechan Reservoir. The best way to enjoy the Brecon Mountain Railway, apart from visiting in person, is to sit back and listen to the sounds of steam as Graf Schwerin-Löwitz copes manfully with her train through the marvellous Brecon Beacon scenery. The trio of South Wales Preserved Railways is completed here at Bronwydd Arms, 3 miles north of Carmarthen. This is the Gwili Railway, which is named after the river, which is crossed no less than 8 times along the 8-mile route from Abergwili Junction to Llanpwm Saint. So far, only the first 1.5 miles of track has been completed. This was once part of the Great Western Railway route from Carmarthen to Aberystwyth. It was such a difficult line to operate that it often took up to 3 hours to cover the 56 miles between the termini. There were 21 stations to be called at, and everything was done in leisurely fashion. There's no hurry on the Gwili Railway today, and the little saddle tank locomotive takes her time to trundle through the fields to Llwyfan Cerrig station. There's plenty of restoration work awaiting the volunteers who staff this railway on weekends between April and December and daily in August and September. There's certainly no lack of effort, and all the facilities are beautifully presented and lovingly maintained. Olwyn is typical of the industrial designs of her builders, Robert Stevenson and Hawthorne. She was built in Newcastle upon Tyne in 1942 to work at Early Power Station near Reading, where she spent all her working life. She was retired in 1976 and subsequently purchased by the Gwili Preservation Society in 1978. After a lengthy overhaul, she entered service in 1986. Her 28-ton weight and low profile are marks of an industrial design, and she's overshadowed by the large ex-mainline coaches of her train. The Gwili Railway was formed in 1975, and progress has been fairly slow, as a number of difficulties had to be overcome. Now that the railway owns an entire 8-mile length of track bed, it shouldn't be too long before trains have a more worthwhile run to get their teeth into. Aberystwyth is 100 miles to the north of the Gwili Railway. It's a faded Victorian holiday resort which is fighting to make a comeback onto the tourist itinerary. One virtually unique attraction for a resort in the British Isles is the funicular railway, which runs from the north end of the Esplanade up the Constitution Hill. The Aberystwyth Electric Cliff Railway was built as long ago as 1896, so tourists to this part of the Cambrian coast have had easy access to this view for nearly a century. It was originally worked by steam. An engine with a vertical boiler pumped water up into the tanks of the descending car. Not far from the Cliff Railway, in the centre of the town, is the terminus of a 12-mile narrow-gauge railway, which had the distinction of operating the last steam locomotives owned by British Rail. The Vale of Rheidol Railway has been privately owned for a very short period and is now undergoing a revival under its new directors. Although there is now an internal combustion interloper on station shunting duty in Aberystwyth, the railway has always been entirely steam-operated. The Vale of Rheidol Light Railway Company was incorporated in 1897, but it was not until 1902 that the first train clawed its way over the 1-foot 11.5-inch gauge track from Aberystwyth to Devil's Bridge. In 1913, the railway was absorbed by the Cambrian Railways, which in turn was absorbed by the Great Western Railway in 1923. The Great Western quickly produced 2 locomotives to replace worn-out machines, and number 8 was one of them. She was called Llywelyn then, and of course she was never owned by the Cambrian, whose livery she wears today. Although it looks black, it is in fact a very dark green, offset by 7-inch letters extending for 6 feet along the tank sides. The locomotive weighs in at 25 tons and is 8 feet wide. With over 10,000 pounds of tractive effort, this is a large and powerful machine for such a narrow-gauged railway. For the first 5 miles along the valley, the line is almost level, and the locomotive does not have to work too hard. Aberffrwd, 8 miles from Aberystwyth, the line has climbed to 300 feet above sea level, but the hardest climb is to come. "400 feet have to be climbed in the next 4 miles. But this does not seem to be a problem for number 8. The views over the valley become ever more stunning, but the unchecked undergrowth obscures it most of the time. The rock face on the south side of the line is well within touching distance, and it seems incredible that our Welsh forebears decided to build a railway through such inhospitable and difficult terrain. But such were the transportation needs of the mining and agricultural communities of the time. Deep in the shady woods, millions upon millions of bluebells weave a colourful carpet. The railway is far from any road or habitation, and travelling in the train is to be in a time capsule almost unchanged for nearly a century. Eventually, after an hour at a steady 14 miles per hour or so, number 8 brings its train into the station at Devil's Bridge. From mid-April until the end of September, there are 2 return trips a day, rising to 4 in peak periods. There's plenty of time at the mountain terminus to visit the sites around Devil's Bridge. But don't miss the last train back, as it's the only form of public transport available. On the eastern fringes of central Wales, there is another railway which was once inherited by the Great Western. The Welshpool and Llanfair Light Railway has the unusual gauge for Britain of 2 feet 6 inches, and its rolling stock has been gathered from places as far apart as Austria and Sierra Leone. Countess, however, arrived from Bayer Peacocks in 1902, in time for the opening of the line. The other locomotive to arrive at the same time was called the Earl. The line's ruling gradient of 1 in 29 necessitated a short boiler design to minimize the risk of uncovering the crown of the firebox, which would lead to explosive consequences. The 060 design is unusual for a narrow gauge railway with sharp curves. Countess was heavily modified under Great Western ownership, and she exhibits many Swindon features astride her boiler. At Llanfair Cerinian this morning, Dougal, an 040 side tank built by Barclays in 1946, is being shunted by a Hunslet diesel, aptly named Ferret. This 9-mile line was always in a penniless state. Its first station was in a public road in Welshpool, and it had to buy timber wagons on credit. When the signals which the railway could not afford for the opening were eventually installed, it couldn't afford to operate them. On Saturday the 4th of April 1903, under Cambrian Railways ownership, this very locomotive hauled the first passenger train away from Welshpool. At first, there were only 3 passenger trains a day along the line, taking an hour and a quarter for the 9-mile journey. Not exactly a sparkling performance. The railway settled down to an impecunious and relatively mediocre existence. In 1923, the line passed into the ownership of the Great Western, and at last there were the resources of a large organisation to fall back on. The Earl and the Countess were rebuilt and given a new lease of life. The railway settled down once more to its unremarkable lifestyle. It might have been expected that the line would close in 1947, after the hard winter, and unserviceable locomotives constantly led to interruptions in service. Under new bureaucratic nationalised management, British Railways had little time to assess cost effectiveness, and funds were made available to keep the line going. Like a cat with 9 lives, the railway survived another closure attempt in 1952, but the end did finally come in 1956. However, by that time, a committee with the objective of saving the line was already in being, and in 1962, steam was raised again at Llanfair, and both the Earl and the Countess were back on the line. Since that time, no less than 15 locomotives have been either acquired or passed through the hands of the railway, and it's a mainstay of the collection of great little trains of Wales. Long may it continue to be so. The last railway in this second volume of Steam in Wales was once the longest narrow-gauge railway in the country. In the 1920s, the line connected Dinas Junction on the London North Western Railway near Carnarvon with Porthmadog, 22 miles away. The scenic splendour of this route was surely unsurpassed. It wound its way just to the south of Snowdon and on down the wild and steep Aberglaslyn Valley from Bedgellet to the wide Glaslyn estuary. The line arrived too late, however, and buses were already rumbling over the moorland, ensuring that the railway never made a profit and heralding its eventual fall into the hands of the receiver in 1927. Today, the new Welsh Highland Railway has passed from gestation into rebirth as a 3/4-mile long shadow of its former self. But there are solid plans to reopen the whole 22 miles, which would surely make it one of the most spectacular narrow-gauge railways in Europe. This is a special weekend on the Welsh Highland, and there are no less than 5 steam locomotives in action. The smallest of them is Britomart. She's owned by a consortium of Festiniog Railway volunteers, and to her falls the task of hauling the demonstration freight train. The pretty little machine was built by Hunslet in 1899 for the Penny Orsedd slate quarry. Montalban was built by Orenstein and Koppel in 1913 for a colliery in Spain, where she spent all her working life. The Welsh Highland shares the slim gauge of 1/4 11½ inches with many of the other preserved Welsh railways. And locomotives like Montalban had a strictly industrial purpose, hauling light loads in confined spaces. Rishra is another locomotive which spent her working life overseas, this time in India. She was built by Bagley in 1921 for the Pulta Waterworks, where she hauled coal from the riverbank to a boiler plant. She was found abandoned by an Englishman in 1963 and restored by apprentices at a chemical plant as an engineering exercise. Wouldn't it be wonderful if more steam locomotives could be rebuilt that way? Rishra went to the Leighton Buzzard Railway in 1971 before going on display at the National Railway Museum in York. Now she's back in operation on the Welsh Highland. From India, we move to Africa, where Karen spent most of her life. She was built in Bristol by Peckett in 1942, at a time during the war when few industrial locomotives were being produced. In the late 50s, the 6-mile Saluki Peak Railway in what is now Zimbabwe dieselized, and Karen returned home. She's been at work here since 1983. Russell is one of the finest preserved locomotives in the British Isles. The machine is the only remaining locomotive from the original Welsh Highland Railway. But during its lifetime, it was severely butchered to fit the narrower loading gauge of the nearby Festiniog Railway. The restoration project by Welsh Highland volunteers, using their own facilities, was from a complete wreck to a superb recreation of her original form. Russell is extremely powerful and is the mainstay of Welsh Highland service. There are also several diesels in operation on the line. Catherine came here from Pilkingtons, as did her brother Jonathan. Perhaps more than any other line, the Welsh Highland sums up the spirit of all the Welsh railways we've seen. Each has its own dedicated and resolute band of volunteers, determined to overcome any obstacle to continue running steam in Wales. Each has its own development plan, and all are breathing fire and steam back into hopeless locomotive carcasses for the enjoyment of tourists and discerning railway enthusiasts alike. Long may the sounds of their efforts echo around the mountains and valleys.